Hi, my name is Frank Callahan. This talk is about my mother's family, the Crowleys, and their family business, Polar Beverages. Polar is now a national company under the leadership of my cousins, Ralph and Chris Crowley. And while the company has grown exponentially under their management, the foundation for their success took place through the efforts of their father and his three brothers. In this talk, I will discuss the beginnings of the family in the United States, the founding of the company and its history, but end just prior to the time that my cousins, Ralph and Chris, took the reins. Polar was founded by my great-grandfather, Dennis M. Crowley. Known as Boss, he fostered a legacy of a family business that now is in its fifth generation. Family businesses are the most common form of business, but most do not last beyond 2 generations. And while the Crowley family has been deeply close over the years, the transition of passing the business from one generation down to the next has been challenging, partly due to illness. In addition, the closeness of the family, rather than easing the process, made these transitions much more challenging. I will talk a bit more about that topic at the end of part 2. We are called Famine Irish. Worcester people must wonder, why are there so many Irish? The answer is the potato. Here's why. The potato is native to South America, and there are more than 4,000 varieties on the slopes of the Andes Mountains, and hundreds of potato varieties have been domesticated for human consumption. Due to its nutritional value, starting in the 1500s, the Spanish invaders brought a handful of varieties of the potato back to Europe, and it's believed that the potato was brought to Ireland in 1580. Because of the temperate climate and damp soil of Ireland, the potato adapted well, even in marginal land of poor quality and rocky soil. Gradually, more potatoes were planted because they could feed more families. For instance, grains native to Europe, such as wheat, required 5 acres to feed just one family. The potato could feed 3 families in the same amount of land, and no horse or plow was needed. By the 18th century, because the potato fed more people, families grew, and the impact of this growth was that the Irish population almost doubled from 3 million in 1750 to 5.25 million in 1800, and by 1845 the population had grown to 8.2 million. This growth was particularly strong in the poorest areas where the families became over-dependent on the potato. By the 1840s, roughly 3/4 of the people of rural Ireland, mostly the poor western counties, were largely or totally dependent on this subsistence crop for their source of food. However, because one high-yielding variety known as the Irish lumper, ugly name, was dominant throughout the country, almost all of the country's potato crop was a monoculture or monocrop. And with no genetic diversity, the entire country was vulnerable if disease struck. And so, when a blight caused by a fungus appeared in 1845, it attacked the entire potato crop throughout all of Ireland and attacked again and again each year until 1850. Specifically, the blight literally choked the plants to death by wilting the leaves and turning the plant back black and so rotten it was inedible. This was particularly devastating in the poor western counties because of their overdependence on the potato. And the lack of another food source led to starvation. In that decade alone, it's estimated that 1 million Irish succumbed to diseases related to starvation. And in addition, between 1 to 2.5 more Irish left their homeland for other countries, most of them to the United States. And most of those that went to the United States went to places where the Irish had previously settled, such as Worcester. This pattern of following other immigrants is called chain migration. And in the case of Worcester, the famine Irish followed the Irish who built the Blackstone Canal in the 1820s. More on the canal diggers later. This era is known as the Irish famine. And it was emotionally devastating as the farmers did not know what was happening. They could not understand why their food had gone bad. And it was not for many years that the blight became understood. It's for this reason that the famine left deep emotional scars with memories tinged with shame, survivor's guilt. Immigration to the United States during the famine and after became a more popular option for the Irish as travel across the Atlantic Ocean became safer, faster, and less expensive. This is the naturalization document for Cornelius Crowley, who came to the United States on the 29th of March in 1852. What's important here is that the date of his arrival to New York is indicated, so his passage to America can be found. At that time, immigrant women only became U.S. citizens upon the date of their marriage. So there's no naturalization document for the woman that he married here in the States. And so the date of her arrival would almost be impossible to find. Liverpool, England was the major port for transatlantic ships due to the booming import of cotton from the plantations in the American South. And the famine Irish became the return cargo to New York, where 3/4 of the ships sailed. At this time, 90% of European immigrants departed Liverpool to cross the Atlantic to America. This is the manifest for the ship Racer, which sailed from Liverpool to New York in 1852. Cornelius is listed as a laborer from Ireland. For some reason, his age is listed as 15, which was 2 years younger than his real age. He was 17. Maybe he was looking for a discount. You see the little blue arrow right there? That's Cornelius there. And then up here on the right is a Currier and Ives print of the Racer. And as its name implies, it was a clipper ship. Clipper ships were sailboats designed to be faster or sail at a good clip. Those able to leave Ireland were relatively wealthier, as opposed to the poor who could not afford passage to America. Ireland was very rural, and so the immigrants were mostly referred to by the county where they came from rather than a city or town. The eastern counties of Ireland were wealthier, and the immigrants from those parts emigrated to Worcester in family groups prior to the famine. For instance, my Callahan ancestors came from Queens County, an eastern county, just prior to the famine, and came as a family. So they came as a group. And my great-great-grandfather, my great-grandfather, his wife, they came, about 4 or 5 of the Callahans came as a group. During and after the famine, immigrants from the poorer western counties started to come to America and typically came to Worcester all by themselves. Most were illiterate. From the ship's manifest, we know that Cornelius Crowley came alone, and from his naturalization document that he hailed from County Kerry in southwestern Ireland. But his family must have had better means, as both he and his family could both read and write. Here's some family letters from the 1870s. On the left is a letter from my third great-grandmother, Mary Ellen, maiden name Sullivan Crowley, to her son Cornelius. On the right is a letter to Cornelius from a nephew named John B. Crowley, who served in the U.S. Navy. Here are my great-great-grandparents, Cornelius and Ann, maiden name Moriarty Crowley. Both came from Killorglin in County Kerry. Again, both came from a poorer western county. It is believed that most famine Irish hailed from the middle counties, but there's no documentation. Anecdotally, it's believed that in Worcester that many famine Irish hailed from County Kerry. But it's likely that more Kerrymen came in the 1870s due to what I called chain migration. Because there were no opportunities for women in Ireland, Irish women immigrated to the United States in equal or greater numbers than men. In fact, by the end of the 19th century, 53% of the Irish immigrants were single women. During this era, Irish women traveled by themselves to America, and coming to the United States was unique among European women at that time. So, for instance, Irish women came all by themselves. Women from other European countries came with their husbands or their families or their parents or whatever. Irish women came alone. In America, 60% of these single women found work as domestic servants or else found work in factories. Importantly, if they remained single, they did not become U.S. citizens, and I'll talk about that at the end of this section. Ann Moriarty was from a family of 7 children, and they settled in Milford, Massachusetts. Presumably, Ann met Cornelius in Milford as they married there in 1856. Like her husband, Ann could both read and write English, so her family must have come from better means, and possibly she came with relatives. We do know that her mother's maiden name was Ellen Howard, and that Ellen had converted to the Catholic faith, which might have been an indication that they had better means. Soon after his arrival, Cornelius worked in shoe factories in a job called a boot crimper. Boot manufacturing in Worcester was thriving in the 1850s, and nearly a third of the workers in these factories were Irish immigrants. Early in his career, while working on a machine, Cornelius was lashed in the eye by a piece of leather, and as a result, lost the vision in that eye. That is why this photograph is in profile. So there's a map of Ireland, and you can see County Kerry in green down there in the very bottom, so it's southwest Ireland. Take a swig of Pola. As they had in Ireland, the first generation Irish had large families. In fact, by 1900, 30% of the city of Worcester's population was either first or second generation Irish. Out of 118,000, 30% of them were first and second generation Irish. Ellen, the first of their 9 children, was born in Milford, and the growing family moved back and forth between Milford and Worcester over the next few years. Dennis Mark, the third oldest, was born in Milford in 1862. So you can see Dennis standing there on the right, and then Eugenia will talk about that. And by the way, that's Johnny right there sitting in the middle. So that's Art Crowley's father, just for your connection there. The family lived in tenements around South Worcester until Cornelius and Ann purchased a plot of land in that section of the city in 1888 on Sheridan Street, which is adjacent to the Sacred Heart Catholic Church on Cambridge Street. On the left is the deed of purchase, and the mortgage documents with People's Savings Bank are on the right. Second generation Irish lived at home until marriage, which helped their immigrants' parents pay the bills. The house is one of Worcester's many three-deckers, and like a lot of the immigrant Irish, the family probably pulled their incomes along with the rent from other tenants in order to pay the mortgage. Their payment ledger is on the right, and the mortgage payoff is on the left in this one. This is a follow-up on the previous documents. This must have been a big deal to the Crowleys, as they were Catholic, and most of the land in Ireland was under the control of Protestant landlords, so they had few opportunities for home ownership back in their native land. One day, a stranger appeared at the front door of 10 Sheridan Street and asked for Eugenia Crowley. His name was George Reedy, and he had seen her in church. He lived nearby and was a graduate of Holy Cross. He asked her to marry him, but divulged that he had a heart condition. So if she said no, that would be okay, and that he would go into the Catholic priesthood. She said yes. They married, had 2 daughters, and George died of heart disease at age 45. Eugenia and her daughters remained at 10 Sheridan Street after the rest of the family moved on. So there's the house on 10 Sheridan Street. You can see the map right there. At the left-hand side is Cambridge Street, and the church is in red, and there's a picture of the church. Eugenia was a public school teacher, which was very typical of second-generation Irish women in America. For instance, in 1908, 49.8% of Worcester public school teachers were second-generation Irish women. And by 1910, the majority of public school teachers in Providence, Boston, New York, Chicago, San Francisco were second-generation Irish women. There's Dan. Hi. In fact, Chicago, it was 70% were second-generation Irish women. The neighborhood where the family lived was known as the Island due to the construction in the 1820s of the Blackstone Canal. The Mill Brook, which was the canal, had a large bend in the stream in South Worcester. To shorten the route, the workers who were hired to build the canal dug a straight channel that connected each end of the oxbow so that water flowed around the meadowlands in the middle. I believe this channel caused long-term problems, which I'll discuss at the end of this section. So can you see the oxbow? Up at the top there is Kelly Square, and the stream, the Mill Brook, goes meandering around and then comes back into intersection of Cambridge Street, and I think that's Harding right there. And they built that long channel, and so the land in the middle became the island. The island fostered the Blackstone fostered the American Industrial Revolution through the investments of the Yankee Protestants who lived in Worcester's town center. Due to the Yankees' hostility of their Catholic faith, the Irish immigrants were forced to live separately, and the island was one of the first Irish settlements in Worcester for the immigrants who worked in the nearby factories that were powered by the water of the Blackstone. By the way, in the 1960s, Green Street was added to the island nickname, so it is now called Green Island. The island was a rough neighborhood, and soon after joining the working world, Dennis became a bartender in the working men's saloons near the factories. He was 6 feet tall and powerfully built, and the family lore was that he was a boxer, which helped him to maintain order in the roughhouse saloons. Like most famine Irish, Dennis was locked into a system with few opportunities. Early in that century, the pre-famine Irish had enormous expertise in building canals. First in England, then they went to New York and built the Erie Canal, then they came to Worcester and built the Blackstone Canal, and then later on they built railroads both here and throughout New England. So they came to Worcester for financial gain. In contrast, the famine Irish were refugees of a massive human catastrophe and had almost no skills to offer. By the time of the famine Irish and their children, the canal diggers were deceased. And though there were some descendants of the pre-famine Irish working in transportation, construction, or retail shops, none of these were the professions that Dennis chose to pursue. In addition, his father had no valuable skills to pass along to him, because by that time the boot and shoe manufacturing in Worcester was in steep decline. Based on his personality, bartending was not a great career choice for Dennis. Most Irish bartenders were engaging personalities who told colorful stories to their customers. Dennis did not fit that mold. He was a teetotaler with ambitions beyond working in the saloons. But like a lot of the famine Irish, he lacked the great skills of the canal diggers, so he had few options for career advancements because of the anti-Catholic Protestant factory owners. There were some second-generation Irish sons in professions such as medicine or the practice of law, but their opportunities were modest. Moreover, Dennis was not a creative genius like other local businessmen, like Lauren Coase, who invented the monkey wrench, or Ichabod Washburn, who improved wire production, or William and George Crompton with their many patents for power looms. What he was, though, was a very shrewd and able businessman, and the only business thriving for the Irish were the saloons, and thus selling alcohol was the path that he chose. By selling alcohol, Dennis entered into a tricky situation, as the Irish had a bad reputation for problem drinking. Lots of arrests for the Irish during those days from the saloons. It's for this reason that the selling of alcohol was opposed by the local business leaders, which was backed up by the Worcester newspapers. More importantly, alcohol sales were controversial within the Catholic Church. In fact, most of the local temperance societies were led by parish priests. It's possibly for that reason that Dennis kept a low profile. For instance, there's no advertising for his firm in local publications, nor are there profiles of him in the Nuts History of Worcester or other publications. By the way, in December 1886, Dennis married Mary Rourke, who also grew up in the island. Dennis was 24 years old and Mary a year younger. Like Dennis, Mary was the child of famine immigrants, and her father, Andrew Rourke, came from the western county of Galway. Dennis and Mary lived in the island until their 5 sons were born there. By the way, Andrew Rourke lived at 14 Ellsworth Street, which is in the island. You were asking what street it was, so that's the street. This is Mary, maiden name Kelly Rourke, the mother of Dennis's wife, Mary Rourke Crowley. She lived to be 95, and my mother and her siblings called her Grandma Rourke because they could not pronounce Grandma Rourke. They were a little taken aback by her, though, not only because of her very old age and Irish accent, but by the fact that she smoked a pipe. Just like the Beverly Hillbillies grandmother and Little Abner grandmother, Irish ladies smoked pipes. Mary and her husband raised her sister's daughter, Mary Catherine Cohn, that's spelled C-O-A-N, whose mother died at Kate's birth. Kate was often called Catherine Rourke, and she took care of Grandma Rourke into her old age. So in effect, she was a younger sister of Mary Crowley, Boss's wife. This thing is not cooperating here. It's back. Sadly, while Catherine was effectively adopted at birth, she had 3 older siblings who were placed in an orphanage because they had been abandoned by their father. Many years later, my grandfather regularly sent holiday gifts to the Little Sisters of the Poor, the founders of this orphanage, but his children never knew why. His orphaned relatives must have been the reason. So I've highlighted in yellow the older Cohn siblings that were in the orphanage. The orphanage was across the street from the cathedral, and it might now have been evolved into the Nazareth School. I'm not sure. After several years working in the island saloons, a business opportunity motivated Dennis to leave the island and move with his family to another section of the city to be near this new venture. In 1901, Dennis founded D.M. Crowley and Company at 68 Summer Street in Worcester, and he moved his family to an apartment across the street at 101 Summer. In those days, Summer Street started at Washington Square opposite the train station and ended at Lincoln Square, the busy intersection at the north end of Main Street. More on this Summer Street connection later. At first, Dennis sold liquor from a wagon, and the family lore is that he sold whiskey to factory hands as they left work. Tragically, that first year, Cornelius was killed falling off a ladder at the store, and his mother and his sister also died that year. So in that picture, that's Dennis with the reins on the left. Though the name Ball Brook is actually Trout Brook in Holden. That might be where the factory or the store was on Summer Street. I'm not sure. And that's possibly one of his brother-in-laws who's on there with him. The move to Summer Street appears to have made through a family connection. 4 doors down at 111 Summer Street was J.G. Bieberback and Sons, manufacturing of ginger ales and mineral waters. The lead principal, Johann or George Bieberback, was a German immigrant and master brewer who introduced lager beer to Massachusetts and New England. In 1882, he founded the firm with 2 of his sons, and within a few years they sold whiskeys, wines, cordials, etc. The Bieberbacks both lived and worked at 111 Summer Street, so they must have had close contact with the Crowleys, as they were very close neighbors and in the same business. In addition, they had a family relationship. George Jr. was married to Cecilia Daniels, an Irish immigrant, and a cousin of Mary Rourke Crowley, Dennis's wife. The Bieberback connection is the reason I believe that Boss left the island. He must have felt it was important to be closer to their business on Summer Street. Though I have no documentation, I believe they worked in concert in their businesses for many years. For instance, almost all of the saloons were owned by Irish Catholics who might have been reluctant to buy liquor from the Bieberbacks, who were German and Protestant, but would from another Irish Catholic. Moreover, the Bieberbacks advertised prominently in the Worcester directories each year, while there's nothing for D.M. Crowley and Company, which tells me they had no need to advertise as he worked so closely with the Bieberbacks. In a related matter, the Bieberbacks at this time were being sued for non-payment of loans, and there's a reference to a company bankruptcy, so that might have been a factor for why they worked together in their businesses. Finally, most second-generation Irish remained in their home neighborhood. Why did Dennis leave an apartment in a 3-decker which his father had bought for him and leave a job in the home neighborhood to move to a new neighborhood and start a company unless he had some confidence in the future success of this business associate? The Bieberback connection must have been very promising. Over the next 2 decades, D.M. Crowley and Company did well, but by 1916, the public sentiments against liquor were growing, so Dennis diversified his business. First, he bought the wholesale bottling division of the Bieberback firm, then a few months later purchased the Leicester Polar Spring Company, which was a branch of a Maine company. The photo on the right here is of their Worcester office, which was on Mercantile Street in Worcester. And by the way, the spring is still owned by Polar Beverages. It is located on Polar Spring Road, which is actually the town line between Leicester and Spencer. And it's also along what is called the Mid-State Trail. So that sign right there is where the Polar Spring is, out on the Leicester-Spencer line. Dennis, now known as Boss, named the company Bieber Polar Company, the combination of the names of the 2 companies he had purchased. The 1882 Bieber Polar founding date may have come from the family connection to the Bieberbacks and the business they must have done over the years. But most significantly, Boss purchased the Bieberback bottling plant at 111 Summer Street, where the business had been located since 1882. 111 Summer Street remained the headquarters until the late 1960s. After the company moved, the buildings were demolished, and it's now a parking lot for a medical arts building at the corner of MLK Boulevard and Summer Street. So it's diagonally opposite the Worcester Post Office, and it remains an Irish enclave because we all go there to the skin doctor. Is that correct? Yes. Dennis and Mary's 5 sons were Cornelius J., known as C. Joseph, born 1887, Frank Andrew, born 1888, Eugene Dennis, born 1891, Walter William, born 1893, and my grandfather, Edward Dennis, the youngest, born in 1896. When the family lived at 101 Summer Street, the Thomas Street Grammar School was visible from their apartment window. And here's a photo of my grandfather's Thomas Street school class. The school was at the corner of Thomas and Summer Street, where the Visiting Nurse Association or the VNA headquarters is now. And we have a graduate here of the Thomas Street School right here. So That's where it was on the map. The street going up and down, that's Summer Street. There's the Thomas Street School right there. And there's, you see where the arrow is, that's my grandfather in this class photo. And you can see the sons are in order of age. In 1907, Dennis expanded his business interests by purchasing two significant buildings in Lincoln Square, one of the city's busiest intersections. The Dean Building was the smaller of the two and was located at the corner of Summer Street. The liquor store was on the ground level of that building. The Salisbury Building was larger, and the family lived upstairs in one of its 7-room apartments. Seven-room apartments. Brockelman's Market was on the street level of that building. Boss purchased the buildings from the Worcester Art Museum, which controlled the estate of the original owner, Stephen Salisbury III, and the mortgage was through the Mechanics Bank in Worcester. The fact that this Yankee bank made him a loan is quite impressive, as Irish liquor dealers were typically not creditworthy in this era. The two buildings were separated by railroad tracks, and the relocation of the tracks will come up at the end of this section. So you can see the two buildings right there. The Dean Building is right there. There's Lincoln Square at the top in this whole map, and you can see the railroad tracks going between the two buildings in that shot. So those are, in that postcard view up there, the building on the right is not the Dean and the Salisbury Building. They're a little bit farther on the left in that postcard shot. As his older sons came of age, they joined the business. In 1905, oldest son C. Joseph was listed as a clerk in the firm. Then in 1910, the second oldest son, Frank, did the same. Middle son, Eugene, joined in 1913, and finally the two youngest sons, Walter and Edward, came on board in 1916 as chauffeurs in the liquor business. Interestingly, in 1917, Edward is listed as the president of the Polar Spring Division. So you can see on the right is Frank, the second oldest. The oldest one is C. Joseph, he's sitting on the right. You can see middle son Eugene standing on the left, and then sitting on the left is Walter, and then my grandfather is sitting on his father's lap, okay? However, Boss's business plans were interrupted by World War I when 4 of the sons joined the Army. Only son Frank did not go into the Army, as he had married in 1916 and by 1918 had a son. By the way, his son Frank Jr., known as Red, went on to found Ken's Foods, which is another Crowley family business, but entirely separate from Polar. Eugene was the only son who sent to Europe, but by the time he got there, the war was over, and he soon came back. As a small boy, I asked my grandfather the inevitable question of what he did in the war. His reply was, well, I did a lot more than George Washington O'Reilly. My grandfather was a Gus man, and so rather than challenge him, I went to my father and said, who is George Washington O'Reilly? George Washington O'Reilly is a professional Irishman, was my father's response. I then went to my mother and asked, what's a professional Irishman? I was about 5. And she explained it's a self-promoter who exploited their ethnicity for unjustified profit. I concluded my family had a low opinion of George Washington O'Reilly. After the service, the oldest son, C. Joseph, ran the liquor store in Lincoln Square. Second son, Frank, ran restaurants and owned hotels in Miami, Florida, Cape Cod, and later in Worcester. The middle 3 sons ran Beaver Polar, or the youngest sons ran Beaver Polar. Middle son Eugene proved to be a strong businessman who helped build the business. Walter also worked at the plant, but he sold his interest in the business to pursue oil exploration in Oklahoma. Walter later owned a significant parcel of land near what is now Miami Airport. He sold it prior to the Depression. My mother maintained the family owned a quarter of Boca Raton. If so, things would have been vastly different for the Crowley family. Edward ran the plant. He had a relaxed business style, and each day at lunch instructed the employees to shut down all the machines so that they could play the card game of cribbage. One time he received a perfect score in cribbage, and word of his accomplishment got back to the local newspaper, which published his score, to his complete outrage because he could not stand publicity. Prohibition, the constitutional amendment banning the sale of alcohol, had a profound impact on the family's businesses. They knew prohibition was coming because in 1917, the U.S. Senate proposed the 18th Amendment, and by January 1920, the Volstead Act codifying the amendment took effect. The law banned alcohol sales, but did allow for the sale of alcohol for medical purposes. Based on this quirk in the law, my grandfather, Edward, was briefly a pharmacist at the liquor store. But business at the liquor store must not have been great, as a little bit later, C. Joseph ran a lunch wagon. The term bootlegger became popular during Prohibition for the illegal sale of liquor, and the word's origin comes from the 18th century smugglers who put valuables in their large sea boots to hide the items from the authorities. There are some anecdotes that the Crowleys were bootleggers during Prohibition, and while these stories are entertaining and most likely true, bootlegging was not a significant part of the business. In reality, Beaver Polar thrived during Prohibition through a close connection to alcohol sales that was completely legal. An explanation is needed here. Obviously, Prohibition totally changed the drinking habits of the nation, but in ways that are not well understood. Prior to Prohibition, the consumption of beer and hard liquor were roughly in the same proportion. But because beer took up so much space to transport, and it was not as expensive as hard liquor, the result was that beer consumption declined by 90% during Prohibition. On the other hand, spirits or hard liquor could be transported in a concentrated form. So the consumption of high-proof liquor actually increased during Prohibition. Prior to Prohibition, whiskey was the most popular drink. It was drunk straight and at room temperature. Think of all the cowboy movies we've seen where the bartender places a shot on the bar for the cowpoke. That habit changed because bootleg whiskey tasted lousy, so mixers were needed to improve the taste. It was at this time that a lighter flavor of ginger ale, known as pale ale ginger ale, grew to be the dominant seller in order to mix with whiskey. More significantly, jumping off of me here. More significantly, gin became the dominant drink because it was easy to make. Just mix grain alcohol with juniper extract. That's it. It's for that reason that during Prohibition, the term bathtub gin was coined. However, drinking gin straight did not appeal to the taste of the drinking public. So quinine water became a strong seller to make gin and tonics. Despite Prohibition, America experienced tremendous growth in its consumer culture, and cocktails became very popular because electric refrigerators could produce ice for drinks. This lifestyle was depicted by F. Scott Fitzgerald, whose fiction portrayed the flamboyance and excess of the Jazz Age. His best-known work was The Great Gatsby, published in 1922, which featured the bootlegger Jay Gatsby as the protagonist. The novel references several cocktails, and club soda was often a key ingredient in cocktails such as Gin Rickeys or Tom Collins drinks. Soon after the law went into effect, smugglers known as rum runners shipped rum from the Caribbean to the eastern shores of the United States, where rum was mixed with carbonated cola to make rum and coke drinks. Beaver Polar did quite well during Prohibition because their products were mixers for illegal alcohol. But these mixers were not meant for the general public. And by general public, I mean my family. My grandmother Crowley felt Polar was terrible stuff, and she did not allow her young children to drink any Polar products. In 1919, Boss Crowley purchased a home at 75 Lancaster Street, across the street from the Worcester Art Museum. The four unmarried sons lived there. His wife Mary was a very good cook, and the sons came home for lunch every weekday. And on weekends, they entertained relatives. Dennis owned one of the first cars in Worcester, and there was a garage in the yard to store the vehicle. The house was demolished in the 1950s for additional parking for the Trinity Lutheran Church. So these are schematics that my mother did of the interior of the house. And on this map on the right-hand side, at the very top is Salisbury Street, and on the extreme right is Lancaster Street, and the arrow points to where the house was. Out of the side of the map is the Worcester Art Museum, just to give you some reference where that house was. These are some aerial shots of the house that I got from aerial maps at the Worcester Historical Museum. And that's from a postcard of the front of the Worcester Art Museum. You can see the front of the house in that one. And then I commissioned an artist to do a drawing of what we think is what the house looked like from those aerial photographs. And up in the top there, I apologize that I didn't Photoshop that photo, but that's Eugene, the middle son, who was at Polar. That's Boss Crowley, and that's at 75 Lancaster Street. You can see how ornate the railings are on the porch. That's my Uncle Dennis, the boy on the left, and that's my mother on the right there. And also I want to mention the beautiful clothes that they all had. You'll see just gorgeous clothes. Boss retired in 1920 and purchased a home in Monument Beach in the town of Bourne on Cape Cod. My mother visited the house as a child, and one night her uncle Eugene came home late, having spent the night evening drinking and carousing with two notorious twin sisters. Gene was a booming character of the roaring 20s and was his mother's favorite son. But his wild ways, at least on that night, did not sit well with his mother. Upon his arrival, she confronted him, and their loud shouting match terrified my mother so much that she opened her bedroom window and crawled out onto the roof because she was convinced they were going to murder each other. The reason for her reaction is that she had never heard adults shouting. Her parents were very gentle people who never argued nor raised their voices. This is a significant thing, by the way, in the history of the family. Two of the hotels that Frank Crowley owned were the Hotel Norcross and the Hotel Standish. The Norcross was located a quarter mile from the Monument Beach house, and when Frank owned it, it was a dive. He sold it, and the subsequent owners did nothing to improve it, and it remained a dump. Each time the hotel changed hands, the new owners placed an advertisement in the newspapers calling it the new Norcross. It's for that reason that our family always referred to it as the new Norcross. It was demolished in the 1970s and replaced with a private home. Frank later owned the Standish, which was a residential hotel on Main Street in Worcester. A portion of that building has been removed, but the Standish remains across the street from the downtown YMCA. Frank lived there with his family, and he also ran the cafe that was called the Standish Cafe in the Salisbury building in Lincoln Square. So he had two Standish cafes, one in the hotel and one in the Salisbury building in Lincoln Square. After Boss died, Mary Rourke Crowley, the mother, moved into the Standish with Frank and his family. Boss passed away in 1930 at age 67. His estate was administered by his oldest sons, C. Joseph and Frank, along with their mother. In 1935, his widow, Mary A. Crowley, drew up her will, which appointed her youngest son, Edward, to be the executor. In the original will, she stipulated that the house at 75 Lancaster Street be left to Edward and that the mortgage be paid off by the estate. She also indicated that her share of Bieber Polar Company be left to Edward's oldest son, Dennis. She made specific dollar bequests to her husband's relatives and to her cousin Kate Cohn, and her jewelry was to be divided amongst her daughters-in-law with one notable exception. 45-year-old son Eugene, the one who was at the Cape House in the shouting match, when he was 45, he married his 19-year-old secretary. She was not to receive a piece of jewelry in the will. So in my interpretation, Mary must not have approved of their marriage. 2 years later, Mary made a codicil to her will that the portion of her estate for her son Walter be placed in a trust to be managed by the Mechanics Bank. This stemmed from Walter's alcoholism, which made him incapable of administering his own affairs. Later that year, Walter's wife filed for divorce, indicating that said husband has contracted gross and confirmed habits of intoxication caused by voluntary and excessive use of intoxicating liquors. Mary passed away in 1939, and making youngest son Edward the executor to the will caught the older brothers by surprise. For 6 months later, brother Frank filed to dispute the will. Disputing a will is quite unusual, and while there's no reasons indicated, it may have stemmed from Walter's illness. Also, I'm interpreting that Eugene had some issues with it too, because he was bipolar. For instance, the legal steps, drop that down. The legal steps for her will were made 2 years after. When she made the codicil, that was 2 years after the original will, so maybe that had an impact on why they disputed the will. In any case, within 6 months, the settlement was drawn up, and it indicated that 75 Lancaster Street was now to be encumbered. In addition, the dollar bequests to the relatives were reduced, and there's no mention of jewelry in the settlement, nor mention of Dennis receiving her share of Bieber Polar. When my mother learned of the bequest of her grandparents' home, she begged her parents to move to 75 Lancaster Street, as she loved that house so much. They would have none of that idea and sold it. I believe it would have been controversial to move into that prominent house because it would have upset the brothers. In the early 1950s, the Salisbury and the Dean buildings were taken by eminent domain and demolished for the urban renewal project to move the railroad tracks in Lincoln Square into a tunnel to be constructed under Lincoln Square. C. Joseph had lived in the Salisbury building, and he and his wife raised their 2 sons there. He passed away in 1946 at age 59, and a few years later, his widow moved the package store to Tatnick Square section of the city. Our cousin Ann Crowley ran the business until about a decade or so ago, and the package store sign, which was on the Dean building, you can see it right there in the picture in the middle, that was moved to the Tatnick Square store. So that sign still exists, but it's inside the store now. Notice that the Polar billboard building is more prominent. It's more prominent in the next slide. Here's a schematic of the apartments, how big the apartments were in the Salisbury building. I just plugged that in. So that's where C. Joseph lived, and where Boss and his family lived for a part of their lives before they moved to Lancaster Street. Here's the view of the Salisbury building from the auditorium, and a better view of the billboard on the Salisbury building. In the photo on the right, please note the Standish Cafe and Brockelman's Market on the first floor of the Salisbury building. So I don't know if you can see the writing there, but you can see the Standish Cafe and you can see Brockelman's Market on the first floor of the building. And that view on the left is taken from the Worcester Memorial Auditorium looking towards the buildings in Lincoln Square. So this is the next to last slide in part 1, and so I'd like to end this section by asking, whatever happened to Boss's old neighborhood, the island, known as the island? Polar Park is in the island. So the Polar Park, the top of the island is Kelly Square, and so up at the top, in the middle part on the map on the left, is the Kelly Square area. So Polar Park is right in there. So ironically, they didn't really leave the neighborhood. And then I also mentioned what I think is an issue with the channel that goes down there. So what happened was, way back when, before the Blackstone had that channel, the water would come on the stream and would meander through South Worcester. And when there were heavy rains, the water would wash up over into the wetlands in the middle, which is the island area, and they would soak in. It was like, in effect, a sponge. So it soaked in the water, and then gradually, as things dried up, the sponge would release the water back into the stream and down it would go. So after they built the canal, that meandering part is gone now, and all the land in the middle that used to be wetlands that would soak it up is now dry. So now all the water goes straight down the channel, and so when we have heavy rains, we have flooding down at the intersection of Cambridge Street and Harding Street. It seems like it's almost like a tourist attraction. People know when there's heavy rains, there's going to be flooding down there. I just want to close with a little follow-up on the famine. In the last half of the 19th century, it's estimated another 4.5 million Irish came to the United States. The population of Ireland has never recovered. It is the only European country to have a smaller population than in the 1850s. All the other countries have grown exponentially. The population of Ireland is around 6 million. Before the famine, it was about 8.2 million. Ireland's greatest export is its people. So that's the end of part 1. So I'd also like to mention that Worcester has been very lucky that we have experts in Irish history, and this is one of the books by Tim Maher, who's a Worcester native, and he's a professor at Catholic University, although he's recently retired. But I guess he's come back to Worcester on a few occasions and spoken at Holy Cross and others. I've seen him speak at his father was a judge in Worcester, Black Jack Maher, and his brother is Andy Maher, for what it's worth. So, any questions? Should I jump into part 2? Yes. Hope we can find it. Now the transition from generation to generation had commenced, and Edward, my grandfather, though not the most dynamic businessman of the brothers, was in a position to take over Beaver Polar and pass on the company to his 4 sons.
Edward appeared to be able to manage money, which may have been the reason that his mother appointed him the executor to his estate. His brother Eugene was a dynamic businessman, but she must have felt that Edward was a more stable hand to guide the company going forward. And the fact that Edward had 4 sons to take it over may have added to her logic. Edward was a very kind man and a real gentleman, but he had old world values. Once when his family was dining out at a restaurant, 2 men were discussing money at a nearby table. In his mind, talking openly about money in public was very crude, so he had his wife and family get up and leave the restaurant. Mind you, he was the owner of Beaver Polar. On one occasion, he ran into a cousin downtown and asked her why she was there. She replied she was looking for a bicycle. The next day, a car pulled up at her house, and a man got out of it, delivered a bicycle, got back into the car, and drove away. This pattern of anonymous giving was similar to the holiday donations Edward made to the Little Sisters of the Poor that I talked about in part 1. He had somebody drop off the gifts, so the recipient was never informed of who made the donation. Edward regularly invited his children's friends to come over to his house and socialize, and a younger cousin remembered how noisy and boisterous the Crowley family's house was compared to his own house, which was much quieter. Everybody knew he was a kind man and was deferential to him to the point of fawning upon him, much to the annoyance of my mother, who was pretty much the same way. He was very straight-laced. Once my sisters and I persuaded him to take us to the movie West Side Story at the Falmouth Theater. The portrayal of the ethnic street gangs was just too much for him, and when the movie started, he left his seat and went out into the lobby and paced around. As soon as the rooftop scene with the Puerto Ricans came on the screen, he came back into the theater and made us all leave. That's just too much. Oh, there's the picture of my grandfather. I'm sorry, I was still in part 1 there. So there's my grandfather right there. Despite his sterling reputation, there is a bit of a scandal in grandfather's story. My grandfather, Edward D. Crowley, married Kathleen L. Donnelly on January 19, 1922 at St. Patrick's Cathedral in Manhattan. The reason why they eloped to New York City becomes clear with the birth of their first child that July. Researchers of family history will tell you that early babies are more common than supposed, and that these marriages are often very happy, which was definitely the case with Edward and Kathleen, who were devoted to each other. However, when I broached my mother about her brother's birth being 6 months after her parents' wedding date, she became all flustered and changed the subject. She idolized her parents. She would not hear or tolerate even the mildest discussion of a hint of a scandal about them. Edward and Kathleen had 7 children. On the right is the oldest, Dennis Crowley. When he was born, Boss exclaimed, "He'll be Dennis Marker, he'll have no name at all." Because he was named for Boss, he was the favorite of his grandparents. My mother was born in 1923 and was named Mary Valentine after her mother's sister, who was born on Valentine's Day. Early in her life, her brothers called her Sidder because they could not pronounce the word sister, and the nickname was shortened to Sid, for which she was universally known throughout life. Next was Ralph, born in 1925, who was named for his mother's brother, Ralph Donnelly, who was killed in combat in World War I. Because of this, Ralph was reportedly her favorite child. Edward came next, and while named for his father, quickly gained the nickname Ego due to his supreme self-confidence, which he could often justify. So you can see there's Uncle Ralph up at the top in the middle there. There's Ego standing to the right. That's Dennis. There's my mother sitting at the left. Daughter Kathleen was born in 1927 and was named for her mother, but her father gave her the nickname the Powerful Katrina after a character in the comics section of the newspaper, which was shortened to Tinky. By the way, that's Dan Rassicott's grandmother. Then Carol, the youngest daughter, was the prettiest of the girls, and she was born in 1929. And then finally came James Corcoran, known as Jimmy, who was born in 1931 and was named for his mother's ancestors from Clinton, Mass. So you can see Jimmy, he's not quite on my mother's lap. There's Tinky in front, and there's Carol in the middle. This family photograph was taken at 135 June Street, which is near Worcester's Newton Square on Worcester's west side. Edward owned the house, and the family lived on the first floor. The second floor was rented to his brother Frank and his family. By 1932, Edward's young family had outgrown the house, and so they moved to 9 Belvedere Avenue in the Burncoat section of Worcester near Wauwickus Road School and Interstate 290. Edward continued to own 135 June, and his brother Walter later moved in there with his family. So you can see on the left, 135 June, that's a two-family house, and then 9 Belvedere is at the top. Years later, my grandfather owned the Cape House, and he spent his summers there. Grandfather had no social ambitions whatsoever, and my father declared that Edward went through life with princely disdain. He went for 2 walks a day with a cane that he didn't need at all. Mr. Sweeney lived across the street, and grandfather hailed him each day as Captain Sweeney, but never really had a conversation with him. He never went to the beach, and when I asked him if he ever went swimming, he replied, only on the Feast of the Assumption, which is a Catholic day of holy day of obligation. It's August 15th. I doubt if he ever even went swimming on that day. After World War II, my grandparents encouraged their children to bring the guests to the Cape House, and the house was packed on the weekends. The gang went to the Silver Lounge in Falmouth and drank umiaks, a rum drink. The owner of the Silver Lounge coined the name because he purchased the rum at a steep discount in Alaska, which had a surplus of rum when the military left that state after the war. He named the drink for the native Alaskan kayak, and the umiaks were so cheap the gang had way too much to drink, then came home and slept on the floor or on the padded benches that were around the edges of the living room. On the following Sunday morning, grandfather roused them all up to go to Catholic Mass at the nearby church in Pocasset. So in that shot, there's my mother sitting there. That is Carol. That's Red Crowley. I think that's Franny Heffernan. That's the Brown Shoe family. She married Frank Rooney, who went on to be the chairman of Melville Corporation, which owned Tom McCann Shoe and CVS Pharmacies. I think that's Paul Hanlon in the back. I can see Tinky up in the, blocked off by Franny Heffernan. So, and that's at the Roar Bar. That's not inside of the Silver Lounge. Edward's brother Eugene passed away on May 6, 1948 at the age of 57. His death was due to Berger's disease caused by heavy tobacco use, but Gene was also a heavy drinker, which must have contributed to his passing at a fairly young age. While there's no obituary, the company did publish an advertisement in the Worcester Telegram honoring his memory. I think this is kind of strange. This guy was the president of Polar Corporation. There was no obituary, so something odd was going on. I view Gene as a tragic figure, as he was a dynamic man who helped Beaver Polar thrive during Prohibition. These laws were meant to regulate morality through the elimination of the sale of liquor, but were mostly ineffective. Worse yet, the Prohibition backfired because instead of modulating behavior, it gave rise to the organized crime. Gene was not a criminal, but he became completely caught up in that world. Obviously, his mother, Mary Rourke Crowley, knew that Gene spent most of his nights carousing with Iacone and the local wise guys. So in response, I believe she steered Beaver Polar towards Edward and his sons. So this guy was really helped build that business by getting into all the stores or the bars that were selling liquor and getting Polar into those places. But he got caught up in that lifestyle, and he really made the company thrive, and it backfired on him. Before and after World War II, Edward's oldest 3 sons joined the business. Youngest son Jimmy came on a few years later after college and the military. As soon as the sons came on board, Edward retired from the daily affairs of the business at age 55. At first, the business was barely profitable. It was a real struggle for the 4 sons to support themselves, their families, their parents, and their uncle's widow. It's for that reason that Gene's widow sold out her share, as an income from the company was not enough for her to live on. And while it was challenging for the sons to get by on their own, in reality, the situation was absolutely for the best because they were left to make all of their own decisions. That's because their father, Edward, was a very old school gentleman who probably would have hindered the business. And the few times he did come back to visit the plant, he told them to turn off all the machines because it was just too noisy. With Prohibition long gone, there had to be a better way to sell soft drinks. So how did the Crowley brothers build the business that had previously featured selling mixers for alcohol? First, they marketed Polar as drinks for the general public, with ginger ale being their lead flavor. But we can think of some of the other great flavors. Grape was one, orange dry was another popular one, strawberry was another one. But there's another important reason of how they grew the company. The marketplace was changing and they took advantage of these developments. Here's my example of how they built the business. This photo is of the original Iandoli market in Grafton Square in Worcester. Like the Crowleys, the Iandolis had several sons in the family business who expanded the company from literally a mom and pop store into a regional chain of supermarkets in central Massachusetts. And during the growth of this supermarket chains, the Crowleys built great relationships with the Iandolis. Ego Crowley was in sales, but all of the brothers had a hand in Polar's success. The brothers really serviced the accounts well. I remember my Uncle Ralph's station wagon was filled with wrenches, hoses, tubes, all kinds of spare parts to service the customers on weekends. He often took his sons and the neighborhood kids along to visit the bar or the local corner store that he was servicing. Brother Jimmy did the same a few years later, and he took his sons with him also. Ego competed with the Cokes and the Pepsis by placing Polar on the supermarket shelves. On weekends with salesmen, he cleaned the shelf space and placed Polar in key locations. It sounds simplistic, but take that model and multiply it by all the local supermarket chains in Massachusetts. Typically, they were family-owned, little mom-and-pop stores, and so the Crowley families built great relationships with the local supermarket chains. Big D, Victory, Big Y, the list just goes on and on. All these supermarket chains, they were little mom-and-pop stores that were owned by a family. The family expanded them into supermarket chains, and Polar got their product on the shelf of those supermarkets. In addition, some of the larger chains were making their own house brand of soda pop. And Ego Crowley used the sale of bottling private label offerings as a means to build a good relationship with the family chains, and that way got Polar onto the shelves of the supermarket. Because of that model, they could really compete with the Cokes and the Pepsis in selling soda in the local supermarket. So this example right here is Market Basket. If you go to the Market Basket, you can buy their house brand, and they've got colas, and that one's a lemon lime. That was bottled at the Polar plant, okay? If you went into one of the warehouses at Polar, there'd be hundreds of brands of all these supermarket chains. Ralph and Chris probably couldn't even tell you how many different brands there are in the place. In this time, Edward and Kathleen traveled to visit their children. Tinky was in California and Carol in Oregon. Both were married and had young children. Jimmy served in the army in Germany, so they went to visit him there. However, this photo looks like it's in St. Mark's Square in Venice. So there they are, right there. Business was thriving, and the sons got along well at this time, partly through the moral authority of their father. However, a potential family crisis was looming. Ego was dating the very beautiful Elizabeth Coe. Nicknamed Sis, she was from an old-time Yankee family. In fact, her grandfather, Lucius Briggs, was the architect of the auditorium and the Worcester Country Club. And her great-grandparents were the Jeffersons, who owned the Jefferson Mills in Holden. I should clarify here, her last name was Coe, C-O-E. That's not the same family as the Coe's Wrench, that's C-O-E-S. Grandfather Crowley was a strict Roman Catholic who attended Mass daily, so the boys knew that their father would not approve of Ego's marriage to an Episcopalian. Keep in mind, their father still owned the company. And though they ran the company, they did not own it. I don't know if that's a good deal. But anyway, sometimes they came home and divulged to their families that things were tough at the company, but they never blamed their father. They just kept on plugging away. I think that's a hallmark of the brothers. In order to keep this key employee, namely their brother employed at Polar, the brothers purchased a bottling plant in Hartford, Connecticut. After their marriage, Ego and Sis moved to Hartford, where their 2 children were born. It was not until years later that Ego divulged to his wife the reason why they had moved to Hartford. This photo was taken at my family's house in Mass Ave in Worcester the night before Jimmy's wedding to Kathy Fallon, the daughter of Dr. John Fallon, the founder of Fallon Clinic. Though Dr. Fallon had passed away, the family still owned an estate in the center of Shrewsbury. Archbishop John Wright, the former bishop of Worcester, officiated the wedding, which took place in June 1961. This event was a high point for the family, but sadly, grandfather died a year later in October 1962. It was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which made it difficult for daughter Carol to come to the funeral, and Tinky at that point lived in Australia, so it was impossible to come. Unlike his brothers, Edward was a teetotaler, but like them, he smoked, and his diet was not good. Thus, he lived a few years longer than his brothers. He was 66 years old at the time of his death, and his passing was front page news. So there's the gang. I put the names up at the top there, and they're in a chronological order. Soon after grandfather's death, the Hartford plant was shut down, and Ego and his family moved to Wellesley Hills. In 1966, the brothers changed the corporate name of the company from Bieber Polar to Polar Corp. Though ginger ale was their leading seller, they did not want the company to be known for one single flavor. However, for many years, Polar ginger ale was synonymous with the name of the company. Each summer in high school and college, my mother told me, "You're going down to the shop," which meant that I was going to go work at the Polar bottling plant on Summer Street. That's the term our family meant to mean the Polar bottling plant. We never said Polar or the bottling plant. We always called it the shop. There were some workers at Polar who were holdovers from my grandfather's days, and the most notorious was an old coot named Harold Martin. One day, my Uncle Jimmy told me to follow Harold around the plant because Jimmy said Harold did nothing. Harold, who was in charge of mixing the tonic flavors, was the only one who knew the formula for ginger ale, Polar's best-selling flavor. He refused to tell the brothers the formula for their flagship project, so they could not fire him. Jimmy figured if I followed Harold around, maybe Harold would... If I followed Harold around, maybe Harold would get annoyed and finally divulge the formula and retire. The next day, first thing in the morning, I went up to the syrup room, which was several large stainless steel tanks on the second floor in the back of the plant. I knew that Harold lived by in an apartment next door. In fact, I should say really close by. Soon after I arrived in the syrup room, the window opened up and Harold Martin crawled through the window. That was his commute. He crawled through the window each workday, and when he chose to go home, which was any time he wanted to, he could crawl right back out through the window. I greeted Harold, who was an old grouch, and he grumbled at me as I followed around the plant as he grabbed at other employees who ignored him. After an hour or so, I was really bored by this stupid activity and asked Uncle Jimmy to go back working on the line. Eventually, they did somehow get the formula out of Harold Martin, but don't ask me how. By the 1960s, the company had outgrown 111 Summer Street, and a new location had to be found. The final choice was a 6-acre parcel on Walcott Street in Worcester at the Auburn town line. No bank would loan them the money for the move, so the brothers secured a Small Business Administration, or SBA, loan, which they and their wives had to sign to guarantee the loan. Ego's wife, Sis, was reluctant to sign, and it took some persuasion to get her to do so. This was a period when oldest brother Dennis was influential in the decision on where to move. Dennis had an odd personality and was difficult to work with, but in this case, he was part of a good decision, as Worcester has been a great place for Polar, principally because of the great workers here in the city. Grandmother Crowley did the ribbon cutting for the new plant, and she was the owner of the company. Years before, my mother told me that Grandfather Crowley gave Grandmother Crowley the company, to which I replied, "What if they get divorced?" Which that made my parents laugh heartily. After grandfather passed away, grandmother declined both mentally and physically, despite the total support of her children. This was very sad because my grandmother was a wonderful woman who, when her children were growing up, pushed them to be brave and to be strong. The Callahan and the Crowley families were very close, and one day my grandmother Callahan, who was very formal, asked grandmother Crowley, "Kathleen, don't you want to be helpful to your children?" And grandmother Crowley politely said no. She didn't care anymore. At her bedside, at the Cape House, she listened all night to a Midwest talk show host because she was just terribly lonely. She passed away in 1971. I do not know whether by leaving Polar to grandmother Crowley, grandfather Crowley thought that she would hold a moral influence on her sons, but sadly that would prove not to be the case. In her will, written in 1965, the brothers received larger shares of the company, and the three sisters received smaller shares of the firm and the Cape House. The change in the corporate structure in the following year presumably was in concert with her estate plans. Not too long thereafter, the sisters sold their shares back to the company, and my mother bought the Cape House from her sisters. Beginning in the early 1980s, youngest brother Jimmy's mental faculties declined, and a specialist diagnosed that Jimmy had some form of dementia. In response, the family organized this gathering at Monument Beach Cape House. All 7 siblings attended, so you can see their names, and again, they're in chronological order. All 7 siblings had children of their own, and roughly half of the cousins in the next generation attended the reunion. So that's half of us. That's only cousins. So it's a big, big, big family. And these cousins had families of their own. So all those little kids in this picture are now grown, and most of them have families of their own. By the way, that little guy with the striped shirt in the bottom there, that's Dan Rassicott. Unfortunately, soon after Jimmy's illness was diagnosed, the brothers started legal battles over the control of the company. Ego wanted to buy out the other brothers and take over. However, Ralph's 2 oldest sons were already in leadership positions at Polar, and so Ralph wanted to protect their interests. The brothers' dispute drew the attention of the media, and after negotiations, the result was that both Ego and Jimmy's shares in the company were sold to Ralph and Chris, and this started the transition to the next generation. After the settlement, Dennis held a significant portion of the Polar stock, but his messy personal issues overtook his business decisions. Years earlier, his first marriage had ended in divorce. He then married a second woman who divorced him, remarried him, and divorced him again. By the late 1980s, he was married to another woman who was much younger than he. It was during this marriage that Dennis had an unhappy parting with the family business. Soon after his ouster, he divorced that wife. He subsequently traveled to Russia to find yet another wife and married a woman who aspired to look like Marilyn Monroe. After a few years, he divorced her. After that, Dennis hired a detective to track down a daughter whom he had fathered out of wedlock at the end of World War II. By the time of their meeting, she had a family of her own, and despite their many years of separation, both father and daughter had a good relationship. This is the last slide. Like the famine Irish, our family went through a crisis for which we did not know about nor would not understand for many years. What I have not mentioned is that Jimmy was a star ice hockey player both in prep school and college. In fact, he was the captain of the Hebron Academy hockey team and starred at Hamilton College teams. Tragically, these were the days before hockey players wore helmets, and we now believe that Jimmy had suffered from multiple concussions during his hockey play. We do know that on one occasion, Jimmy was hurt so badly at Hebron Academy that he was sent home for 2 weeks. Sent home for 2 weeks to recuperate. Though we did not know exactly what was going on at the time, we now believe that Jimmy had CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which can cause early dementia. Maybe if we had known about CTE at the time, things would have been vastly different, but that's very hard to say. Fortunately, both the business and the family survived because our parents and their parents took great pains to leave their children out of their business disputes. Namely, they did not drag their children into their arguments over money. And so the younger generation remained very close. That's the big takeaway on how the family and the business, and possibly how the business survived. In closing, I wish to comment that my generation of cousins are very pleased with how Ralph and Chris have run the company. I also feel that our parents and our grandparents would be very happy that they have kept Pola a company with family values. Thank you very much. How do you do for time?